Hey guys, I'm Dr. J, and today I'm going to be making my third ever homemade mold. Now, this is a plaster mold that you normally use for making, props and stuff. And the prop that I'm going to be casting today is this cool eyeball that I sculpted out of wet clay, and it's covered in the gloss spray paint, which you'll find in Distortions Limited video. They have a lot of really great stuff that explains all the details. But essentially today, I'm just going to be showing you how to mix the plaster correctly so you don't overfill this, and also so you don't waste a bunch of plaster. It's a pretty simple concept, but it's also a very important one when you're sculpting, because if you mismix it, then you'll end up with something that's kind of like decomposed granite the next day that you look at your mold. So let's get started. Alrighty, so the first thing we have to do is measure the amount of water we want to mix with our plaster, because I have a fair amount of water here. Here's the line right here, and it's basically going to determine how much plaster or wet plaster I have to cover my eyeball here. So I want a decent sized button around this thing, like a plaster button. So what I want to do is basically start shoveling plaster into here, and it's kind of a technique. You do want a good scoop like this, just a regular garden scoop, but it's good enough. So we just want to start shoveling this stuff in, and you want to be careful. Basically take it and just kind of sprinkle it in. Now this will take a while. You don't want to just plop it in immediately, because that agitates it. You want to kind of carefully kind of shake the shovel like I'm doing right here and let it fall in. Now you want to do this for about, I don't know, 15 minutes maybe a little long depending on the scoop that you have. But basically until it's right up to the water level and the surface of the water starts looking like some sort of cracked mud, that if you touch it, you kind of plunge down into the wet plaster, but it should be pretty darn full, and I'll show you the consistency when I'm done. Okay, so I've poured all my plaster in, and the level of plaster in here is basically up to here, and you'll notice it's risen because the plaster is moving the water out of the way. But basically, it should look something like this. You know what, I'll just pop up a picture. But it looks kind of like a dried up lake on the tip of the surface of the thing. And that's what it should look like because the plaster is completely filling it, and it's kind of muddy. Now for this part, you might need gloves, because what we're going to do is start ladling over here. But the first thing we have to do is actually mix this up a bit, and then we're going to take a chip brush and kind of dust over the eye like this, so we get into all these little cracks and crevices so we don't miss any detail. Okay, so like I said, we have to mix it first, so I'm just using this stick here. Make sure it's not too dirty or anything, but it's actually really muddy already, so we do have to hurry, because if you've ever worked with plaster before, you will know that this stuff dries like a speed demon. So kind of get all that, and it's actually very thick now. Very thick. So now what we do is we basically just take a brush like this, and we dip it in nicely. And I got a lot of plaster on here, and basically just like paint all the detail over. It'll kind of, come down. But the main part we're focused on are these little veins coming out of the eye. You want to make sure you get absolutely everywhere, because this is the part that the latex is going to graph over in your mold. So you do want to kind of make sure that this stuff is accounted for before just ladling all the stuff over. Okay, now that we have our entire eyeball detailed, so to speak, we have to start putting the plaster over it. And this is a pretty messy process, so you're going to need gloves. So if the plaster starts curing on your hands, it won't burn you. But mainly just to make sure that you stay reasonably clean when you're doing this. Okay, so once you have your gloves on, you're going to start basically taking this little muddy substance inside of our little container here. And you notice it's really goopy right now. There's a lot of liquid in it, but it will start drying out extremely fast. So you basically want to start building up from the base. It depends on what type of prop you're doing. If you're doing perhaps a two-piece mold mask, then it's going to be up on a sculpting board. It's going to be up on a piece of wood. So you might want to start just putting this over the head, where you can see all the little plaster. You can see all this plaster right here, just hardening as we speak. I'm going to take it, and you do want to make sure you're on a surface that you're perfectly willing to get messy, because this is pretty darn messy. And all this liquid that's dripping off here, this is going to harden very fast. So you basically want to take all this, and when it starts to run off like this, you just push it over like this so you don't get a huge mess of plaster that you have to break open with a hammer if you even want to get the darn thing out. I'm going to finish up doing this because it doesn't take too long, but it does take a while to dry, and then I'll show you what the mold looks like once I'm done. Alrighty, I think that about sums up our mold making here, but there's still a few more things to do. Once this is dry, we have to actually take out all the plaster. Now, if you're making a two-piece mold with a really big prop, for example, a full-size head, or maybe even, in the Distortions case, like a Greely Gremlin or something, that's pretty big, you'll be able to just pry apart the mold and take out all the clay individually, and the force of like the big clay will pull itself out. With something small like this, though, you may need to get a pick or something and kind of peel it off without damaging the mold, because it requires just a bit more time and finesse in order to get something small like this out. So before we let this dry, and we'll pull out the latex thing later, I just want to tell you a few mistakes that I made in order to get to the point of being able to show you how to properly make it, because the consistency of the plaster and the water is everything. Once the consistency is correct, you know the mold's going to work. So the first thing, when I was originally making my mold, I made a really cool bat head. I'll put it up on screen right now. It was kind of a bat orc. Spent around a day and a half on it. And then once I was done putting plaster all over it and everything, the next day, I came back to find something that was kind of like decomposed granite. When I touched the plaster, it kind of just crumbled, and it was so weird. I tried to repair it. It didn't work, of course. But that was a mold completely ruined because I did not add enough plaster to the water. Always make sure that when you have water, whatever level it is, that you add enough plaster so that the surface looks like the cracked mud that you're seeing now. And it basically just fills up the entire thing. So it's kind of like muddy, soupy the entire time. It should not feel like water. Even before it starts drying inside of this bucket, it should feel like really thick almost. And then as it dries, like already starting to dry, like this isn't liquid anymore. It's getting hard. But make sure you're not, touching it when it cures. It gets to around 120 degrees Fahrenheit once it's cured, and well, in the curing process. But for now, I think that's everything. So I have let the mold cure overnight, and a few things happened while that was going on. It worked relatively well, but one thing that I noticed while it was curing was that the clay was really dry. Like it was not like the malleable clay covered in the paint that you normally encounter. And this was kind of a problem. It wasn't too much, since this isn't really a professional level sculpt, but it is really annoying because when I was starting to take out all the clay, I had to painstakingly take a sculpting pick, like a little needle-looking thing, and actually take out all of the clay before I put in the latex. And this isn't economical, nor is it professional to have to do this with each of your sculpts. So another thing I can definitely recommend is always make sure that even when you're doing small things like this, that you do not let the clay dry. Make sure that it's pretty wet before you try and do this, because it's a lot easier to just pull it out instead of having to pick it out and run the risk of damaging the mold, because I actually have damaged it a bit here, hence the little irregular indentations here. But I can Dremel those off. You normally Dremel sculpts on like the side where the clay meets the edge of the mold, but this one I'll have to Dremel anyway. One other thing is that a really good case, which is why I brought this mold out, it's a little pumpkin guy that I made, and it was another reason of the downfall of my bat creature. And the reason was I did not let the paint dry all the way. The high gloss spray paint, you normally apply 1 or 2 coats, maybe even 3, but I didn't let it dry all the way. And earlier I said that the plaster gets really, really, really hot once it's curing. Well, if you don't let the paint dry all the way, even if it's dry to the touch, it's not completely dry. You do want to let it really, set in. Is that when this stuff cures, it gets really hot, and it basically melts the paint off of the clay and adheres it to the plaster. So with this guy right here, it basically the paint adhered to it, and now I have to spend a lot of time picking away at it. Now, this also isn't economical or professional, but it's just another little tip for you when you're sculpting. Make sure the paint's dry, make sure you mix it correctly, and make sure that you do not wait for the clay to dry. But anyway, I had a really fun time making this video. It's good to see, the clay turn into a workable, latex prop. I'll probably do a post of this thing fully painted and Dremeled and looking really nice with gloss and everything. But until then, I'm Dr. J, and I'll see you in the next video.